Oil crises are the kind of crises governments always describe as sudden, temporary, and inconvenient. A disruption here, a war there, a pressured route, a few missing barrels. Prices spike, inflation spreads, central banks panic, consumers get squeezed, and the entire economy seems unable to resist gravity and starts falling. But oil crises don't occur randomly. They follow a pattern. The names change, the flags change, the headlines change. The pattern does not. When a modern economy loses confidence in the flow of its most critical input, the damage spreads outward at a brutal speed. This isn't because oil is magical, but because it underpins almost everything. Welcome to Money Legacy. On this channel, we'll explore the power of money and everything related to the economy together. If you want to understand how a disruption in oil can simultaneously shake inflation, interest rates, politics, and financial markets, you're in the right place. Oil is not just another commodity. It is a foundational layer. It fuels transportation, logistics, aviation, construction, mechanized agriculture, petrochemicals, plastics, and much of the physical movement that makes a modern economy feel normal. That's why oil shocks don't stay confined to the energy sector. They spread into food, transportation, industrial costs, household budgets, inflation expectations, and ultimately, politics itself. Research by the IMF on inflation shocks since the 1970s shows that more than 60 such events were linked to the oil crises of 1973 to 1979, and that even successful disinflation after major shocks often took years. The initial disruption is physical. The real damage is systemic. This fragility had been building long before the first famous embargo. Throughout the 20th century, industrial society reorganized itself around abundant oil. Cars replaced horses, highways expanded, suburbs spread, aviation shortened distances, tractors and fertilizers transformed agriculture. Container shipping shrank the world, and military strategy adapted to fuel-intensive, mobile logistics. Oil didn't just support growth, it became part of the design logic of growth itself. In the post-war period, especially from the late 1940s through the 1960s, the developed world came to see cheap and reliable oil not as a strategic variable, but as a permanent feature of life. This was the foundation. The future was built on the assumption that energy intensity, affordability, and accessibility would continue to rise together. Such assumptions are highly profitable, until history decides to send the bill. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the system was more fragile than it appeared. U.S. oil production, which had once balanced the global market, was no longer an unlimited stabilizer. Domestic production peaked around 1970, and dependence on imported oil was rising. Meanwhile, a growing share of marginal supply was tied to the Persian Gulf and its surrounding politics. OPEC, founded in 1960, was no longer just a loose group of producers. It had become a force capable of shaping the market. In other words, the global economy had become more dependent on a strategically critical input whose flow was concentrated in politically sensitive regions. This is not a minor detail in economic history. It is the mechanism itself. Then, in October 1973, war broke out when Egypt and Syria attacked Israel during Yom Kippur. In response to Western support for Israel, Arab OPEC members cut production and imposed an embargo on the United States and some other countries. The result was not just higher energy prices, but a repricing of the fundamental assumptions of the industrialized world. The nominal price of crude oil roughly quadrupled, from about $3 per barrel before the crisis to nearly $12 by early 1974. Fuel shortages, long lines at gas stations, rationing, reduced speed limits, recessionary pressure, and accelerating inflation spread across much of the developed world. In the U.S., CPI inflation rose into double digits in 1974, while growth weakened and confidence declined. What mattered was not just that oil became more expensive, but that one of the most important prices in the world changed in a way that forced nearly every sector to renegotiate with reality. Transportation costs rose. Producers faced higher input and distribution costs. Farmers struggled with higher fuel and fertilizer expenses. Airlines were strained. Shipping became more expensive. Households had to devote a larger share of their income to energy. Governments were squeezed between slowing growth and rising prices. Central banks faced a difficult choice: allow inflation or tighten further into a weakening economy. Stagflation was no longer theoretical. It became a real diagnosis. The real lesson of 1973 was not the embargo itself, but the structure it revealed. The modern economy had become so dependent on abundant oil that even a partial disruption could trigger system-wide political and financial consequences. The shortage was the spark. The design of the economy was the fuel. This is the rule behind every oil crisis. The scale of the damage depends less on the triggering event than on how dependent the system already is. A few years later, the world learned the same lesson with different actors. In 1979, the Iranian Revolution disrupted the supply of a major producer. Production fell, panic grew, buyers stockpiled. Prices surged again, inflation rose, and economies struggled. The trigger was different. The mechanism was the same. When oil prices rise, the shock spreads through multiple channels at once. First come the direct cost increases: fuel, heating, transportation, electricity. Then come the indirect effects. Production and logistics become more expensive. Food prices rise. Then the psychological layer kicks in. Consumers feel price increases directly, expectations deteriorate, and wage demands increase. Central banks tighten to control inflation, which weakens growth and can increase unemployment. The crisis does not stay where it begins. It spreads into prices, expectations, politics, and employment. That's why oil crises are politically exhausting. Governments are forced to choose between bad options: tolerate inflation, slow the economy, or strain the budget. There are winners too: oil exporters and early moving investors. But the burden is borne most heavily by consumers, import-dependent economies, and low-income groups. This pattern did not end in the 1970s. The 1990 invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, the 2008 oil price peak, the 2022 Russia-Ukraine war, and the new Middle East tensions in 2026 all reveal the same structure. Today, we talk about the energy transition: electrification, renewables, batteries. But the system is still largely dependent on oil. Aviation, transportation, petrochemicals, and agriculture remain energy-intensive. That's why oil shocks are still systemic events. Prosperity built on cheap energy is not as solid as we think. The modern economy is not just financial, it is a physical system. It cannot function without ships, pipelines, refineries, trucks, and fuel flows. When the flow of a critical input is threatened, the financial system doesn't sit above the problem, it amplifies it. Every oil crisis reminds us of the same thing: invisible dependencies eventually become visible. Thanks for watching until the end. If you want to stay instantly updated on content like this and learn how money shapes power, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video. Stay wealthy.